Hi, I'm Gary, and this is episode 110 of EV Musings, a podcast about renewables, electric vehicles, and things that are interesting to electric vehicle owners. On the show today, we'll be looking back with a number of EV owners to check in on their EV owning experience. This season of the podcast is sponsored by ZapMap. Before we start, I wanted to say we're now halfway through season 6 of the podcast, 10 episodes in, 10 to go. Still to come this season, we have a couple of episodes looking at the state of local councils and their approach to public charging. We'll look at workplace charging, and of course the last episode will be a round table episode. Let me know who you want on that show and I'll see whether I can get it arranged. Our main topic of discussion today is around, well, we're checking in. We're at the stage in the EV life cycle that the market is opening to people who can no longer be called early adopters. More and more EVs are being sold every day to the point where the best-selling vehicle of any kind in the UK in September was the Tesla Model 3. But if we go back 3 to 5 years, we encounter a completely different situation. The picture was markedly different. At that stage, we had the people who were willing to live through the smaller range cars, the slower charges, the poor infrastructure. In other words, the early adopters. And today, I wanted to bring a couple of early adopters together and chat with them about their experience with electric vehicles and check in with them about where they are in their EV journey and whether they think things have improved or not. So let's start by introducing the people who are going to be discussing this. First, we have Greg Yaskovich. You may know him from the Take It EV podcast and Twitter feed, where he displays his contempt for plug-in hybrid drivers and Tesla fanboys alike. But if you went to the Fully Charged Outside this year, you'll remember him as the guy with the straw hat that had the built-in solar panel and the cooling fan. Welcome, Greg.
Hello.
And secondly, we have Gary Whittaker. Gary's former guest of the podcast, having been a part of episode 14, where he came on and talked about living with his Jaguar I-Pace. He runs the I-Pace Owners channel on YouTube, and he can be heard on the Digital Lifestyle podcast, where he discusses, amongst other things, electric vehicles. Welcome, both of you gentlemen.
Thank you.
Hi.
Yeah, thanks for you guys.
Glad to have you both on here. Let's just have a sort of a quick sort of opening question on this, which is, Greg, how long have you had an electric car?
I had my first electric car on this. I think I've received it on the 7th of January 2016. It was delayed due to chip shortages or something like that, if you believe it or not. And it was 30 kilowatt hour Nissan Leaf.
And Gary?
So my first proper EV was the I-Pace, but I had been driving EVs quite a bit before that. I'd done quite a few EV challenges over the years, taking things like Teslas to Berlin and so he's halfway across the country. But the I-Pace, which I've now had almost spot on 3 years, was my first proper EV I actually owned.
Now, you mentioned there about Teslas and sort of doing challenges with those. I think we'll loop back and talk about Tesla separately because I know Greg has opinions on those, and it's a completely different situation when you look at Tesla and how they've improved over the years when you compare that with some of the other models that we've got. So I think we'll talk about Tesla separately. But what were the reservations that you had, Gary, when you first started thinking about getting an I-Pace? Was it just, yeah, that's it, I'm going to go for it? Or was there something in the back of the mind that said, well, I might have to think about this?
I did have, I went through quite a lot of thought processes. I mean, one of my big challenges at the time was I was living in a flat. I didn't have access to charging at home. I couldn't get access to charging at home. The landlord wasn't up for putting a charger in, had no power to our garages. So I wasn't even able to run a 3-pin plug-in that way. So that was my biggest reservation about going fully electric was how I was going to cope. But I knew my local shopping centre, which is only a few miles down the road, had Type 2 charging, and it was free as well. So that worked quite well for me. And that's basically how I survived for a year and a half. I'd go down and do my shopping and charge at the same time, which was enough to keep me going. But that was a big question mark I had, whether I could actually work it in that respect.
Yeah.
And that's also one of the reasons I'd held on a little bit for getting an EV. And I'd really been keen on getting an EV for some time. But I needed just that little bit more range in the car to allow for the fact I would only charge once in a while. I could do all my journeys for the week and then top it up on my sort of to 3 hour shop I used to do. Yeah, so that was where I was. And also, I mean, thanks to Osprey, they fairly shortly after I got my car put their chargers in locally, and I was able to use those as well. Quite a lot of the time on free vend, which was lovely. So yeah, I mean that was a big thing, which made it very workable.
Indeed,
it was a challenge. I was a bit uncertain at the time, but I was really pleased I had done it once I'd done it.
And Greg, with the Leaf, was that I'm going to get one, no problem, or did you have any reservations before you took the plunge?
I actually was curious about, or EV curious, in 2012. Somebody told me at work that BMW is coming up with i3, essentially. I could be getting the year wrong, could have been 2013. And I was just about to switch a car when I lived in Belfast, and they had a Volt, Vauxhall Volt. I think that's what it's called. No, sorry, Vauxhall Ampera. That's the name of it. But they couldn't let me test drive it because it was dead. The 12-volt battery died.
Yeah,
and that kind of put me off for a bit. I got a diesel car instead, and then I moved into London, and I've test driven Tesla twice when they came out, and I was blown away by it. But there was no way I was going to pay the full sticker price, even though I could have afforded it at the time. Every so often I had an episode of like, let me look at the car, a different car, and I was trying to find somebody who could let me test drive the car. Nobody had them in stock apart from Teslas. Obviously, they had plenty of them, and Nissan were happy for me to have the car for a weekend, and that just sold me basically. I did live. We were living in London in a flat at the time, so I didn't have any charging available to myself, but there were plenty of chargers. I wouldn't say plenty. There were enough chargers around to get me going, and I did commute to London. And the idea was basically that I'll be driving that car to London, and parking in Westminster was free for 4 hours for EVs at the time. Right. And there were enough charging points to get by. And I just basically bought it.
I'm going to come back and talk about how we knew what was there from a charging infrastructure point in a second. But personally, for me, as listeners to the podcast will know, I've got the Kia Soul. I've had it for 3 years. But what I don't know whether I've told a lot of people is the reason I went for the Soul, apart from financial aspects, is I went up to our good friends at the EV Experience Centre in Milton Keynes, and I said, I would like to borrow a Soul for 3 days. And they went, yeah, no problem, 50 quid, there you go. And I was able to come down and check out the local charging. I was able to do the longest trip that I would be doing on a daily basis from a commute point of view. And, I did that without any issue. And once I got over those two reservations, could I do a daily commute in it? And could I find places to charge? And when the answer to both of those was yes, it was a no-brainer. So that was the reason that I ended up with the Soul, and those were the reservations that I had before I started to do it. So looping back around to the question that we were talking about a few seconds ago is, Gary, how did you know where the chargers were back when you first got your iPace?
Well, I think I was quite lucky because by the time I started, things like ZapMap were getting quite common, and PlugSurf, and PlugShare, and all the likes. So there was quite a lot of places I could actually research before I even bought the car. To find out what it was. And also I'd seen the chargers. I mean, that was probably actually one of the big key things. And Peterborough has been pretty active on getting charging infrastructure, at least was back then. The council was pretty proactive. And there were chargers, Type 2 chargers on most streets, which were very visible. I know Greg's got his own opinion on plug-in hybrids, but I'd reviewed the Outlander a year or so beforehand. And I'd actually been able to use the infrastructure at that point. And I hadn't actually done any research at that point. I'd just driven around and seen where the chargers were and plugged in on Type 2s. Didn't really have much rapid charging at that point available. And a few of them were, it's a completely different story now, but I was able to see the installs occurring by just keeping an eye on ZapMap at the time. And I think that was definitely a luckier situation than some of the people I know who like Greg got his car a bit earlier. It was a bit more challenging to find out where charges were at that time.
So yeah, Greg, how did you know what was there? And were you using ZapMap or PlugShare, or was it just wandering around and going, oh, I wonder what that is? Yeah.
I've got Asperger's. Living with such fantastic issue of your brain is fantastic, because if you if you turn your mind onto something, you're fully in. So once I test drove the Leaf, and we basically test drove a 24 kilowatt hour Leaf. Took it with my girlfriend at the time, now wife, to a pub. I had to charge it on the way back. I did do I didn't know of existence. I can't remember when the EV Experience Center actually started, but I didn't know of them. And I lived in South East London, so obviously it's quite far. I then started, once I was through the test drive. I started looking for all the rental companies in the area, if they had any EVs that I could actually rent. I think it was Hertz, actually. They had Leafs in London that you could borrow. So I rented them for a couple of days at a time, and started just going and actually testing never mind researching it online, because I knew there's chargers out there. But I actually started driving from charger to charger and just kind of looking at it and playing with them, essentially. It's the same approach I have to anything in life. I just dive in for a week or two, and then that helps me kind of make my decision. And at the same time, my diesel car basically started breaking down all the time, because I've only been doing short journeys. So I was fully committed. I just decided to myself, this is it. I'm just gonna get that Nissan Leaf. And that was it. As far as the charging goes, the garage that I bought it from, they had a rapid charger, so I knew every so often I'll be able to plug it in there. But like I mentioned, the trips to London also helped. The fact that I was able to plug it in London, for a few hours during the day, during the week, that helped out. In the end, once you find out that there's chargers, and once you come to terms of how this whole system works, it was easy.
Yeah. Did you know at the time that a large proportion of the Nissan dealerships actually had a rapid charger at their location?
Yes, so the one that I bought it from, the actual one, because it was a chain, it was in Bromley, and I lived in Penge, which is near Crystal Palace. So the one that I actually bought it from, they even told me, look, you can drop down this bollard after hours, and you can get in and plug yourself in if you're stranded. Happy for you to do it. So they were very accommodating and very open at that time. And once again, the fact that they would give you the car for 2 days, and I was actually given it for 4 days because it was a long weekend, was basically a game changer to me. I don't think I would have gotten that particular car at the time if it wasn't for that particular option.
So we've talked about how we all got our vehicles and why. We've talked about how we worked out what the charging infrastructure is. So to me, the next big stepping stone or hurdle, depending on how you want to look at it, is taking the first journey, which is longer than the range of the vehicle that you're in. So tell me about that, Gary. What was your first long distance journey?
That's going back a bit. I actually think my first journey was to go to the Jaguar Breakfast Club at Gaydon. I got an invite to that, and that was just beyond my range at the time. Because I was actually travelling up from down south. I'd actually done a journey the day before down to my parents, my dad's, and was coming up then to Gaydon. So it was about 240 miles, which was at the time the range of my iPace is actually slightly improved now, and I probably would be able to do that. But it was getting about 180 at the time.
Yeah.
And that was an interesting experience, because it was the first time I actually had to rapid charge en route. I hadn't really planned the journey, because that was all a bit of a sudden. I'll get an invite to this. How do I get there? The next day, and I just basically set off and tried to charge at the services, which was at the time was a bit of a disaster, because the iPace and the electricity weren't talking very well. I then tried at a eVolt charger, and that failed as well. So I couldn't run, because again at the time they weren't talking to the iPaces very well. I finally found an Osprey one which did work, and that got me there. But yeah, that was an interesting experience, and did slightly put me off to start. But then I thought to myself, no, you're busy, Gary. You can plan this. You've got all the stuff there. It's easy enough to find all this stuff. Yes, if I was a lazier driver, it would be a problem.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think that's an issue for drivers, the general public, when we start getting to the general populace over us, the adopters, is that people don't want to plan. They just want to be lazy. They just want to turn up with services and charge, and that should work. And thankfully, that's starting to happen now. But yeah, back then that was a bit more of a challenge to do it. But I persevered, and then probably 6-7 weeks later, I did 10,000 miles to Berlin.
We'll come back and talk about that in a second, because that intrigues me for a number of different reasons. But I want to just ask Greg to come in and here and talk about his first long distance trip, please.
So I mentioned that we went to a pub in Surrey when we had the car from the dealership for a few days. Then but that was fairly short distance. I think it was like 90-mile round journey, or maybe even less. But obviously, I drove it too hastily and had to charge on the way back. One of the rentals that I had, I think I went to. I've got some friends living in Leicestershire, so I went to visit them. They live in Colville, from London. So that was the first trip where I stopped and started using the Ecotricity cards, because I've ordered all the cards in the world. There was so many of them, and I would just basically stop at every service station just to see the chargers, just to experience it. And I remember it said at the time on the chargers to drive like the wind, and which I did. And then once I got my actual car, my first super long distance journey was basically from London to Edinburgh via Glasgow, and then back to London via sort of Lake District-ish region. And that took me a long weekend with a couple of stops. And then once again, because of the what it says on the charger, and because I was trying to discover the world of EVs, I would drive 50-60 miles at the time, like I stole it, and then just plug in for another half an hour and just got to Edinburgh that way, and so on.
Now, what's interesting listening to the two of those stories is you've got you, Greg, who is you're using the Ecotricity chargers because primarily they were put in there on behalf of Nissan to work with the Leafs primarily, and you were having very few issues with those. And then you've got Gary, who's sort of the opposite of that. He's trying to use the CCS on Ecotricity. It's not talking because, as we know, the CCS protocol with Medi chargers is not as robust as the CHAdeMO protocol. So you've got two contrasting situations there with two people effectively trying to do the same thing at more or less the same time, and having two completely different experiences, which I think the only thing you would have had in common on there, correct me if I'm wrong, is that none of the chargers would have been in use when you got there because the number of EVs on the road at that time would have been quite small.
Yes, that's true.
Now, let me see, what was my first trip? Yeah, I got the car on the 12th of December, and then on the 19th of December, I went to my parents for Christmas. So that was Hampshire to Yorkshire, 205 miles in a vehicle that at that time had about 105 miles as a range. So straight into, I think I was using PlugShare at that point, into PlugShare, what can I get at about 80 miles? What's the next charger at 80 miles? And I ended up stopping at, I think it was a BP Pulse on the M1 just south of Luton, and then another one up by, where would it have been? Derby. And then I was able to get home on that. But, that was at the time when our good friends at BP Pulse were a little bit more reliable than they are now. And I, like you, had subscribed to a number of the different services. So I had the cards from ChargePoint and New Motion, and I had the subscription from BP Pulse. So, armed with the apps, armed with the cards, armed with a plan of where to go, a charger to aim for, and a backup charger in case there was a problem. I've got to say, it was pretty seamless. None of the chargers were in use. They all worked, and I managed to get there with between about 10 and 15% either time. And it really worked particularly well. And ironically, I'm not sure I've had, particularly recently, as good an experience, mainly due to the fact that you've now got, whilst there are more chargers on the route, there are now more vehicles that are using them. So, I now no longer use BP Pulse, so that's taken all of those off the menu for me. So, I'll use Instavolt, I use GridServe, I use Osprey, and when I get there now, I find they're in use. So, ironically, the very first journey I did, which was the most nerve-wracking because I hadn't done it, was actually one of the easiest I've ever done, and it hasn't actually been quite as easy in the meantime. So a little bit of irony there.
Yeah, I remember actually when we first met, Gary, that we discussed this, that we were kind of living in a perfect time for EVs. The infrastructure was just about enough, and there weren't as many of us as there were going to be.
And I think what that brings up now is almost the point of this discussion that we're having now is, we were there in the old sunlit uplands there of pre-Brexit Britain, where we knew what the infrastructure was like, we knew where everything was, we knew whether it worked for our particular vehicles or not. There weren't that many vehicles on the road that were sort of in competition for the chargers, and things kind of worked. Now we've had pretty much a huge sea change in the way EVs are perceived in the marketplace, in the charging, the infrastructure. So let me start with Greg and ask you, what's the biggest change you've experienced since starting owning an EV?
Well, we always thought that the 2020 is going to be the year of EVs, but obviously COVID kind of got in the way. I think the writing was on the wall that there's going to be more and more of them. What gets me worried is the going back to the experiences on the chargers back when I had the Leaf. Yes, Chatham might have worked flawlessly, but every service station that I would get to, or virtually every single one of them, there would be an Outlander parked there charging at a service station on the motorway, which I still to this day don't understand. Why would you do that on the motorway with a car that can barely do 20 miles on a charge in like a town driving? Anyway, and that kind of stayed with me to this day. I think the biggest thing that has changed, I think, is that people accept EVs now, whereas when I got my first electric car, there was still the hesitation, and everyone was still thinking, "Oh, yeah, this is just a phase. This is we're going to get hydrogen, we're going to get this and that and the other, and the cars will charge in 5 seconds, and all the sort of things that are physically impossible." And and I could have told people that at the time, but nobody cared about these things. Whereas now people kind of just gave up or gave in rather, and are like, well, this actually works, so let's just deal with it and live with it.
Gary?
Yes, so I think the biggest change since I've been driving is the actual infrastructure. I think we're starting to see hubs appearing, and obviously Rugby's not too far away from me, which is amazing.
Yeah,
the good surfing installed there with so many chargers, you can't actually, they stretch as far as the eye can see, as they say.
They do, yeah.
But even there, I've had to queue, only very shortly, but I've had to wait for one to come free. So I think that shows the take up. I mean, it's great to see. I've had discussions with Osprey and Instavolt recently, and what they're doing with the hubs. That's really going to make a big difference, but it's got to come reasonably quickly. But I think also the other thing which is happening, and I've certainly noticed it, is the number of cars coming out now with much larger ranges than when I was looking originally. When I was looking originally, the iPace was one of the longer range vehicles other than the Tesla. And now there's so many cars out there with longer range, and I think that's going to make a difference. So the more cars we have with longer range, the less reliance we need to have on route charging.
Yes,
and it's a bit of a chicken and egg there, but I think it's quite important that correlation. But yeah, it's certainly interesting. I mean, taking Greg's point on the Outlander, actually, that was an interesting thing, because actually seeing an Outlander charging at an electricity charger was one of the things which actually triggered me to think there might be some infrastructure there. I might actually have somewhere I could charge if I've got an electric car.
Interesting.
So it can be a gateway drug. I think but I think nowadays that's far less I mean, there's no reason for having FEVs at all now, in my opinion.
Yes, yeah, and if you've listened to Greg's podcast where he talks about the plugins, you'll definitely know his opinions on that.
but yeah, when I got the iPace, obviously that range was sort of up there with what was really good. And now there's 300 mile range cars, and that makes a huge difference. If you can drive 150 miles there and 150 miles back, and actually get home, that's a long journey on British roads.
Yeah, it is. It totally is. And I think, from my point of view, the major change that I've seen, other than the things that you've mentioned, yes, the infrastructure has definitely improved. Yes, the range on vehicles has definitely improved. But to me, it's the fact that the conversation around electric vehicles is improved. And the prime example, I've literally half an hour ago come off a telephone conversation with my mother, and she was talking to me about battery supply problems for electric vehicles. My mother went 80 years old this year, and she's talking about battery supply problems for electric vehicles. So, 3 years ago, when I told her I was getting an electric vehicle, she was not particularly interested at all in the subject. But now, when people like my mother are now having conversations with, where are you going to stop on your charge on the way back? Are you going to do one charge this time, or are you going to do 2 charges this time? What's your new car going to be? What range is that going to have on it? The number and the sorts of people who are having those conversations are now a lot different and a lot more numerous than they were even 18 months ago. And I mean, we tend to live in our own little echo chamber when it comes to electric vehicles. We tend to follow the same people on social media, etc. But, if I take a step back, and, with people like my mother, who I would not expect her to have a conversation like that at all, and yet, she's been informed about that, so she's actually having that conversation. And then I'm going to drop a few names now. I was on set today filming on a well-known British continuing series setting in a hospital, and one of the actors turned around and said, "I'm really excited. I'm having an electric vehicle delivered today. I've got rid of my Prius." And I said to him, "Oh, what you get?" And he said, "Oh, I've no idea. I just know that it's electric and I'm looking forward to it." So I could not have imagined a conversation like that 2 years ago, 3 years ago. But now it's becoming a lot more mainstream. Now, obviously, there are issues attached to that. And we've already talked about things like chargers being blocked. But the other one is, I put an order down for a new electric vehicle, not telling you what it is. But between the time that I ordered it and the time it was accepted, there was an additional 5-month delay in the delivery because chips, the chips weren't ready, or the batteries weren't ready, whatever my mother was talking about. So, with the increased understanding and knowledge and experience that people have with electric vehicles, there are the knock-on effects that have become associated with that. I don't know whether any of you've got any comments on that.
Well, I was going to say on the chip shortage side of things. I mean, obviously the iPace is a prime example of that. You can't get an iPace for love and money with all the bits you might want to have in it. Head-up display, surround cameras, all those things. You're talking probably a year waiting list to even get on the waiting list.
Wow.
So, and you can get them without those components, and if you're prepared to, and if you were lucky enough to get in before sort of some of the deadlines on the components, you might still have got them in an order. But I'm sort of been told 9 to 12 months before they'll start taking orders for those components again. I mean, in some ways, it's really interesting that that's happening because it shows the demand's there for EVs, but it's also frustrating as well.
It is, and we've circled around this a couple of times in the conversation that we've had so far, but a lot of the issues that we've experienced, a lot of the incidents that we've encountered, and a lot of the problems that we've been talking about don't apply to Tesla. They've always had the far superior charging experience. They've always been able to find the batteries, the chips. I know that they're booking into next year, but I've known people quite recently who've put down orders for Model 3s, and it's been 6 weeks, 8 weeks. We're not talking 9 months or 8 months like it's going to be for the car that I've ordered. Why are Tesla able to do this? Why are they so much better? I know Greg has opinions.
Oh, do I? Uh, so I think I don't know what is the equivalent. This is like a very American saying, but I think most OEMs have been caught with their pants down. It doesn't sound that good when you say trousers down, but basically, I still think that plenty of OEMs treat the EVs as a sort of future thing, and they're in the middle of their transitioning. Hence, why we've been pushed FEVs left, right, and center. Whereas Tesla have been working on EVs from the get-go, so they have everything worked out, the supply chains and etc. And also, I think it's all down to the everyone's talking that Tesla's like 10 years ahead of everybody, which I just hate that sort of speak, because that just means nothing. It's equivalent of somebody saying that you get this, the software you're getting or something, a product you're buying is a product of the future. But if you're buying something now, it's not 10 years ahead, it's now. It's obvious what it is. And it's the same thing with Tesla, because they've been developing things differently from a different perspective. They are able to plan everything with contingency in mind. So when you manufacture, I can speak to manufacturing in terms of electronics. When you're manufacturing, say, a board that does something, whatever, a Wi-Fi or a power supply, whatever it's going to be, when you're designing it, you always create like a supplemental list of components in case one of them goes away, there's a supply issue, or you need to ramp up manufacturing, and the supplier of certain chip can't manufacture enough for you to meet the demand. And Tesla have been working that way from the get-go, whereas your traditional OEM, because ICE cars have been manufactured for God knows how many years now, they've streamlined everything, and the margins are very low, and loads of components are made for everybody. So when you buy a Jaguar or when you buy a Ford, there's going to be loads of trinkets in those cars. I'm just pulling them randomly out of my hat. There's going to be loads of blocks that are the same, supplied by Siemens or Bosch or whatnot. And the particular OEM actually doesn't work on that. They just take that, they buy it from somebody else. Whereas Tesla still manufactures and supplies loads of things internally, so they can, when there's a chip shortage of certain kind, they can pivot and say, okay, well, we need plan B, plan C, plan D for this, and then they can work it out in their software. So they're happy to carry on. And also, like I mentioned before, I still think that OEMs do not ramp up the EV manufacturing to the level high enough for them to actually care about these things. The EVs are still, third tier when it comes to the level of care. I mean, in case of Kia and Hyundai, obviously, we can see that they're ramping up the production and they're switching gears. Same with VW, but most of the other OEMs are still pushing FEVs and ICE cars to people. So I think this is where there's a discrepancy. And also because Tesla, again, they started with EVs from the get-go. They had to work against all the issues that other manufacturers didn't care about: charging network, software, user experience. They had to, obviously, you have to shine in a certain way for people to buy your thing. You have to differentiate yourself somehow from everybody else, and that's what they've been very good at. They're not delivering on 90% of their promises most of the time, on time at least, but at least they've got this sort of glitter effect called Elon Musk, and he's able to persuade people that this is the better thing.
Now, if I can just jump in there, the one thing I always, let me see how I can phrase this without it coming off incorrectly. If I look at the vast majority of the non-Tesla EVs that have been produced since the Model 3, there's nothing which has the range for the same battery size. There are vehicles that have a similar range but a much bigger battery size. There's nothing that has the efficiency, and there's nothing that has the user interface that you can get on Tesla. Now, given that the motor industry is well known for taking some new innovation that one company uses and spreading it across any number of other vehicles from different manufacturers, why are legacy manufacturers not being able to produce a vehicle which has the same type of range as a Tesla with the same efficiency and a user interface that's anywhere near as good?
I think this, in my opinion, the reason is, like I mentioned, the fact that loads of the components in most of ICE cars produced these days are bought from third parties and slightly adjusted or modified to customized to the OEM's need. But there's a reason why all of a sudden all cars on the market, for instance, have lane departure warning systems. It's because Bosch came out with it basically, and the or Siemens or whatever, and you can just buy it and stick it in a car for because all it is at the end of the day, it's I could go to technical details, not as good as somebody who I know who works for OEM who can speak to it, but but it's quite simple to integrate it. Whereas Tesla had to do all these things from scratch. I mean, they do use loads of third-party components in their cars as well. Don't get me wrong; they don't do everything on their own. Where it comes to efficiency, I think Tesla had to optimize their cars for the range, because that's one of the things that people always ask about. Whereas if your primary product isn't an EV, people, they know, other OEMs know that people will buy the cars anyway. I mean, I had a Nissan Leaf. It's probably one of the worst cars when it comes to efficiency, and people were buying them left, right, and center anyway. Today we have MG ZS EV and MG5, and I know people will hate me for this, but they're not the most efficient cars either. Yet people are buying them because the price is very competitive. So it's just one of those things. It doesn't, the efficiency doesn't matter as much at the moment as it should. And on the flip side, there are car manufacturers like Hyundai Group, and they're the second one after Tesla when it comes to efficiency, for instance. So they obviously do care about that.
Gary, any thoughts?
I was going to say, on the Hyundai Kia side, perhaps less so on the Ioniq 5 and the EV6, though, latest things. But, I think there is actually a thing here about expected design from some. Like, I mean, I always remember with Jaguar when I was talking to them about the I-Pace, about why it still had a grille, and they said basically we won't sell it unless it has a grille. Oh. Our dealers won't take it. They'll think it's some strange vehicle and they won't take it in. And that was basically the bottom line. There's a perceived look to a certain type of manufacturer's car, and that actually then leads to inefficiencies in design. I know Ian Callum, the designer of the I-Pace, that was his one thing he had to remorse on. There was the fact that he hadn't changed the front a bit more, made it a bit more. I mean, they did do some clever stuff with the I-Pace, with the way the airflow works and everything through the grille, but it's still got a front grille. And it's interesting if you look at, I mean, we're talking the MG ZS EV now. Obviously, they've come up with that redesign, which no longer has a front grille, has a smoothed off area to make the airflow better. And the number of complaints in the MG group about that, people hating the design. So you can't win. You can't win as a legacy car manufacturer. I don't think you can win on design. Whereas obviously Tesla haven't got that. Tesla have got a design which is very much their design. Yeah. And then yes, day one they actually had something which looked like a grille, and they soon moved away from it. But if you look at a Tesla, it's a Tesla because it's got that sort of that shape to it, and that shape is very efficient. Yeah. But most legacy car manufacturers struggle to produce a car of that shape and actually sell it to their particular audience.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. I think the closest anybody's really come to that from a legacy point of view is the Mach-E, potentially.
Yeah, I mean, as I called it, one of the iPlace clones, along with EV6.
Yes, no, I saw that as well. I thought, yeah, there's a lot of the iPace in both those designs, isn't there?
Yeah, well, it's the EV6 particularly. If you look side on an EV6 and side onto an iPlace, it's very difficult to tell them apart. It really is.
It is,
and that's not a bad thing. I think the design is brilliant. And I think always thought that shape of vehicle is exactly what you want for a practical EV. I think that if you're going to have a proper hatchback design EV, that's probably, and something which looks good. I mean, we can argue on Model Y, whether I know some people love the shape of it, somebody that hates the shape of it, but it is a bit bulbous compared to some of the other cars.
Yeah, it definitely is. Yeah.
One of my younger relatives described it as a Beetle which had been blown up with a air pump, which I think it was a bit cruel, but
no, I can definitely see that. Yeah.
But it's definitely following that design methodology of substance over style, and I think that's actually quite a critical thing. I think Tesla's one of the few brands which can actually get away with that, because they've got the Tesla brand. They can say we are going to do it this way because it's going to give it better efficiency, and blow the fact it's actually going to change and make it force us down a certain styling.
Yeah. Right. Look, we're excuse me, rapidly approaching the end of our time, so I want to sort of wrap up here with an overall question, which is, the three of us here are what could probably be considered reasonably early adopters, but we're getting to that stage now where the people who are starting to buy electric vehicles at the moment can no longer be thought of as early adopters. It's now coming more and more into the mainstream. It's not quite there yet, but it's getting there. So knowing the rate of change of things in the EV world, are you comfortable with the 2030 date to end the sale of new fossil fuel vehicles in the UK? Let's start with you, Gary.
I'd actually like to see it earlier, but I don't think it's going to happen. I mean, the problem is, I think you're right. Actually, the rate of change is not fast enough. Certainly not on the infrastructure side of things yet. We need a lot more destination charges, for example, and some of the councils have been very remiss on that. I think particularly, and the one thing which really worries me is not actually so much the installation of chargers; it's the maintenance of them.
Yes.
There's no incentive to maintain chargers, and that really, I think, has to be there before we can actually seriously get rid of all and get the general populace happy to go to use cars. Because I think one of the things we haven't really discussed is whole destination charging, and I think that is such a critical thing to this discussion. Once you know wherever you arrive, you're going to be able to charge, even if it's slowly. Then the whole EV equation changes and shifts, and it becomes a lot more tolerable to the general public, because they don't have to charge on route. They don't have to find a charger which is working on route. They can just turn up and charge. So I think that's quite critical. But no, I think 2030 is probably ambitious at the moment with the way we're going. But having talked to quite a few people in the industry, I suppose, and Instavolt recently, both of them are really making huge strides to try and push things out there. So I think things are improving rapidly, and sometimes you reach a tipping point. I think we've talked about tipping points before on actual sales of EVs, but I think we're actually reaching a tipping point now on infrastructure, in that some of the big players in infrastructure, non-EV names, are starting to say, we can get into this market and we can start producing charging hubs. And there's quite a few coming out from non-EV companies, construction companies basically, who are going to start putting hubs out there, working with some of their other players. And I think that's going to be interesting to see over the next 6 to 12 months how that plays out.
Yeah, I was interested to see is it MFG, Motor Fuel Group, who are starting to put 4 or more charging rapid charge, high-powered chargers in a lot of their locations, which are, for all intents and purposes, petrol forecourts. But I was up in Putney a couple of weeks ago, the one that they've opened up there. Very, very impressive. A completely separate area that's almost as big as the forecourt that's been set aside for electric vehicle charging. And, it's definitely the way forward.
And of course, they've also got their one in Manchester Stratford, which is actually an EV-only forecourt.
It used to be a car wash, didn't it?
Yeah, it used to be car wash, converted to forecourt, used very much by the locals as a shop, so they get the money that way, and a very, very nice setup on charging. And I think I can see a lot of that starting to happen over the next year or so. There's a lot of money going into EV chargers at the moment, but I think it's got to come quicker. And as I say, the maintenance is the bit which really worries me. A lot of people can get a lot of money up front to actually install stuff, but they don't always want to maintain it.
Yes, and we do have a number of examples of charge point operators who've failed with their maintenance in the past, haven't we?
Yeah.
But we're not going to talk about those now. Greg, do you have any thoughts on reaching 2030 and whether we're going to be able to do it?
Boy, do I! I'm known for opinions, don't I? But I think there's a couple of things. I think in Europe, and technically we're still in Europe. There's going to be a number of legislations coming in next couple of years that I think is going to make life of ICE owners a bit more difficult, especially if you buy a new car. And as far as I know two people who work for OEMs, and from what I was told, none of them actually work internally on ICE cars anymore. They're all kind of just, they're all looking into EVs, battery-powered EVs at the moment. So I think the 2030, by 2030, there's probably going to be still people who will be willing to buy ICE cars, but I think those are the sort of people, on the fringes of the customer group that whereas everybody else I think is going to be far into well into the into EVs, and things are moving along quite nicely. I think I do wonder sometimes, because the infrastructure is way better now than it was when I got my first EV, and the number of cars. If you think about the multiplier of number of chargers that have been installed in the UK, and apply the same multiplier to the number of cars on the road, I think there's way more chargers than cars. Although the growth in terms of the infrastructure has surpassed the growth of the number of cars on the roads. And I do wonder how many of those, how do I phrase it? But I think there's still, because EVs are becoming a bit more mainstream, but there's still a lot of curiosity behind it. And I think loads of people still have anxiety when they get the car and they want to charge as much as they can. So I think we're seeing the sort of the second wave of adopters of EVs now buying those cars and occupying the charging points more and more because they're worried that they're not going to be able to charge wherever they get to. And that speaks to the fact that there isn't enough destination chargers, and I think there should be. There isn't money in destination chargers, and that's the problem. It is something that councils and local municipalities and whatnot should really install, and it should be a requirement to put at least 10% of parking spaces to be equipped with a even 3.3 kilowatts or 7 kilowatt charging point. Whenever you build a new car park or refurbish the existing one, I think that should be just a requirement nowadays. And there's I don't know how much more do you want me to elaborate on this, but I think things are looking up. Basically, the EVs are certainly a bit more mainstream. I used to be stopped, and I used to be talked to at charging points by random strangers, wondering what on earth is this big thing, and wishing me luck, good luck whenever I said this is purely electric and I don't have any backup, and in a non sort of sincere way, like, oh, good luck with that, or sort of, oh, it's going to fail, or you're crazy, basically. Speaking about the chargers, the DC fast chargers, it's not an easy piece of equipment to manufacture and maintain. And I think the manufacturers are also are here to be blamed. And obviously, there's a network that shall remain nameless that they've decided to make their own chargers, and they kind of failed at it. And that just goes to show you that it's not an easy thing to do, to come up with your own charger and make it so that it doesn't need a lot of maintenance and will work for a very long time. What I do like is the fact that we do get more hubs, and I think we should see more and more chargers that are not exposed to all the elements. So they've got some sort of a canopy and shielding away from the elements that I think will increase their longevity, because it's not the use that kills them. It's the fact that they're exposed to everything basically out there.
Oh yeah, that's certainly not going to help, is it?
No.
At all.
No.
So yeah, I think if we have a commensurate increase in infrastructure to match the increase in the number of electric vehicles that are on the road, and match that with a good range of electric vehicles, and by range I mean they don't all need to be SUVs. We do need some smaller ones. We do need some more estates, for example. We do need ones that can tow. We do need the 7-seater minivan type ones. And then if we link that in with cheaper prices for electric vehicles and a little bit better dealer education, I think we'll get there by 2030. Gary, do you have any final words on this?
I just wanted to hark back to what you said about the older generation, actually, because one of my relatives made a very telling remark, I think, the other day. And I know this is another one of Greg's favourite subjects, hydrogen vehicles. My uncle, who's quite elderly, said to me the other day, "What's this about hydrogen vehicles? Don't they remember the Hindenburg?"
Oddly enough, that's what I said to people as well. So,
but he was all serious. He could not understand why such a volatile subject thing would be even considered for a fuel. But interesting again, he'd been seeing, and I think this is one of the key things with this infrastructure increase we're seeing. He'd seen a lot of new infrastructure around him. And he actually said to me, I think this battery electric vehicle idea might be viable for me now. There's at least 5 chargers around here.
Mm. Yeah, and I think that's a big problem that a lot of people have had, which is, I say to them, do you know how many electric vehicle chargers there are in the UK? They go, no. I said, there's thousands and thousands. Well, where are they all? Because you drive past a Shell station or BP station or a Texaco, and you can see, because it's got the big logos up there and it's flashing neon and that, but you don't necessarily see the same thing for car chargers. Instavolt tend to be an exception. They've got that nice glowing strip across the top, but a lot of the other ones, they're hidden around behind a pub in a car park somewhere. And I think if we can increase the visibility of the actual charging stations, it will give people a lot more security in the fact that the infrastructure is there.
Yeah, and I think that's happened. It's starting to happen. I really do think that's starting to happen.
Isn't it today that Grant Sharps, that's his name, isn't it? He's announced the new destination chargers, the design of them. We'll see how, so there's a push from the government now to kind of make them a landmark in the UK, which is for all their flaws, actually a very good thing. Should have been done earlier, if you ask me, but and it reminds me of the story of, because I get that question all the time: where are the chargers? And when you show the people the map, they can't believe that there's one within the area. And whenever we go anywhere, we went on holidays to Devon the other day, and the chap owning the place said to us that we can't charge. But he said, "Oh, but this is a hybrid, isn't it?" And when I said to him that it's fully electric, and we're going to be here for a week, and we're going to be traveling all the way around, Devon and Cornwall, he was like, "But where are the chargers?" I was like, "There's one down the road from here," and he doesn't know about it because it's in the back of the school, basically. So it's not, like I say, it's not signposted as well, either. So you kind of have to resort to apps like ZapMap or PlugShare to actually find it out.
Yeah. Definitely. Any closing comments from either of you? I'll take that as a no.
I could say if you're unsure about electric cars, don't buy a hybrid. Don't let a salesman tell you that a hybrid is better because there's not enough charging out there. Just get a fully electric car.
As someone who had a quote self-charging hybrid, I can tell you they don't self-charge.
No, there isn't a such thing as perpetuum mobile, because that would break the laws of physics. So.
There you go. There's no such thing as a self-charging hybrid. Thank you to both Greg and Gary for their time. They're both on social media and have podcasts, so check them out. Links in the show notes. It's time for a cool EV or renewable thing to share with your listeners. With the end of life or just plain closure of many coal mines, there's a huge potential for repurposing some of these facilities in the renewable space. Such a project is in place in Australia. Muswellbrook, or Muswellbrook, depending on how you want to pronounce it, is a quiet town of about 12,000 people in the Upper Hunter region of New South Wales. It's dominated by 2 coal mines which are slated to close starting next year. But instead of putting 500 people out of a job, the town has been revived with the creation of a renewable energy project. A disused coal void will provide Bells Mountain, which is a local hydro project based at nearby Lake Liddle, with a 250 megawatt pumped hydro facility with 8 hours of energy storage. Energy Estate and Idemitsu will develop a 150 megawatt to 200 megawatt solar PV and associated battery project, as well as a green hydrogen production facility. And all of these projects will bring new life to the town, as well as provide employment for a lot of the miners who would otherwise be out of a job. Taking fossil fuel assets and using them in the renewable space. Great work. The EV Musings podcast is sponsored by ZapMap. ZapMap is the go-to app for EV drivers in the UK. Use it to search for available chargers, plan electric journeys, pay for charging on participating networks, and share updates with other EV drivers. ZapMap is free to download and use, with subscription plans for enhanced features such as using ZapMap in-car, on CarPlay, or Android Auto. And that's the show for today. Hope you enjoyed listening to it. If you want to contact me, I can be emailed at evmusings@gmail.com. I'm also on Twitter @musingsev. If you want to support the podcast and newsletter, please consider contributing to becoming an EV Musings patron. The link's in the show notes. Don't want to sign up for anything on a monthly basis? Well, if you enjoyed this episode, why not buy me a coffee? Go to coffee.com/evmusings. That's ko-fi.com/evmusings. It takes Apple Pay too. If you want a quick reference ebook to read on your Kindle, I wrote a little something called So You've Got an Electric. It's available on Amazon worldwide for the measly sum of 99p or equivalent, and it's a great little introduction to living with an electric car. Please check it out. Links for everything we've talked about in the podcast today are in the description. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe. It's available on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Please leave a review as it helps raise visibility and extend our reach in search engines. If you've reached this part of the podcast and are still listening, thank you so much. Why not let me know you've got to this point by tweeting me at MusingsEV with the words, checking in, #if you know you know. Nothing else. Thanks as always to my co-founder Simon. You know, he's always talking about the rapture, the end of times when we're all judged and sent one way or the other. I'm hoping it at least stays away until I've had a chance to complete my work in progress, which is calculating the last 3 digits of pi. Simon's a bit more keen than that, though.
I'd actually like to see it earlier, but I don't think it's going to happen.
Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.